Welcome. Welcome everyone to Tim's book launch. I'm Catherine. I'm a friend of Tim's and a historian. I'm just going to briefly talk about the book and background information regarding Macau as a gambling city, and I'll pass it over to Tim. We all know that Macau has had a very, very long history with gambling. So it's had almost 180 years of experience with legalized gambling. And people who have been in Macau at different points, they all observe and associate Macau with casinos and gambling. So, for example, in the 1930s, there's this book called Cities of Sin. And in that book, the author described Macau as an evil of itself, marked by its perversions, strange lust, its fever of gaming. And a few years ago, I was teaching a course at the University of Macau, and I asked the students, could you describe Macau using just one word? And a local Macau Chinese student answered with one word, that was casino, and that was it. So that was the word he used to describe his birthplace of Macau. And a few days ago, I met a few Dutch people who had been to Macau for the first time ever. And I asked them, how's Macau? And they said, Macau is an interesting place because on the surface, it's a city that's engulfed in pompous casino structures. But then they remarked that there is a need to start understanding and seeing the city, quoting, from within. And I totally agree with that. And as a historian myself of Macau and of Hong Kong history, I don't see Macau's gambling history as a linear development. So it's got its ups and downs, twists and turns. But as a historian, I think there's three elements that's always been a constant in the development of Macau history. So those three things are network, chance, and luck. And what fascinates me about Macau is how these three elements, they interact with each other through time, and how they sort of we can visualize them by looking at the gambling industry. And by looking at the gambling industry, we see how in different time periods, Macau's soul is shaped and is colored by the gambling industry. And I think this is where Tim's book comes in. I think that his book is an addition to a very slender but a growing literature that have sought to decipher Macau's soul rather than just looking at the surface of Macau. And this book that we're going to see today, Betting on Macau, is something that Tim's worked on a while ago. I just learned. He's been thinking and writing about this for about a decade already before it came out. And it's a merge of his expertise on various forms of gambling, Chinese tourism, and Macau's post-handover developments. So in it, he explains how Macau came to become the world's most lucrative gambling industry. What really impressed me, though, about this book is how Tim takes us on a journey, really, of casinos, but not just a journey through casinos, but of casinos from within. And from there, he connects casinos to this broader terrain of post-Mao economic reforms, of various changes in post-socialist Chinese consumer patterns that have revolutionized not only the ways Macau's casinos are run today, but also it has shifted the dynamics of the three constants that I was talking about earlier, of network, of chance, and of luck, as Macau took on the role of an SAR after 1999. So I'm not going to take up too much time. I'll pass it on to Tim to tell us why Macau ain't Las Vegas. Tim.
All right, thank you. So thank you very much, Catherine. I really appreciate that. Ricardo asked me to arrange somebody to introduce. What's happening? Somebody to introduce the book who's actually read it, and I think Catherine is the only person who's read it so far. So I appreciate her joining me today. And I'll show you her book at the end of the presentation. I have it on a slide here too, in case you're interested. So I moved to Macau in 2001, which was 4 centuries after the first Portuguese explorers arrived, and it was 18 months after Portugal returned Macau to the People's Republic of China in 1999. And 3 years after I arrived is when the Sands Casino opened, the first foreign casino resort in Macau, and everything about Macau changed. So I had the coincidental opportunity to observe firsthand over the last 2 decades the incredible changes that have happened in Macau. And I would venture to say that during that period, there was probably no place in the world that changed as rapidly or as radically as Macau did. So in my book, I try to analyze that period of contemporary Macau, the last 20 years. But to do so, I also try to position contemporary Macau within a much longer narrative, which is the 500-year history of global capitalism, within which Macau played a crucial role at the beginning. And I think Macau is enjoying a reprise of that role today in a new era of global capitalism that is dominated by the PRC. So, and I have some slides here. I would invite you to sort of look at them as I talk. This is the table of contents of the book, and the book is really long, which I apologize for. It comprises 9 chapters divided into 3 sections, and each section begins with a short prelude. And in each prelude, chapter, and section, my organizational strategy is I tried to select one building or object or environment or device or apparatus that I could analyze, because I thought an analysis of that object would say something about what's happening in Macau today. So that's the way the book is structured. And for the purposes of this brief presentation today, I decided to focus on 3 of those objects. So I want to talk very briefly about, first, the Crystal Palace, second, the Golden Globe, and third, the Baccarat machine. And I think this will give you a flavor of the structure and content of the book, but will also maybe say something about the development of contemporary Macau. So I'm going to start actually not in Macau, but in 19th century London, with a short discussion of the Crystal Palace, but you'll see why in a moment, why I'm talking about this. In Notes from Underground, Fyodor Dostoevsky's underground man railed bitterly from his basement hovel against the rational scientism of modern Western civilization and the grandiose utopian schemes of those progressive thinkers who sought to create an unblemished, perfect world. One curious object of his contempt was the Crystal Palace, an enormous glass building designed by horticulturalist Joseph Paxton and constructed in London in 1851 to house the Great Exhibition, which was the first World's Fair. Made of transparent and seemingly weightless materials, the Crystal Palace was a marvel of modern engineering. Visited by more than 6 million people in its first 6 months of operation, it was large enough to constitute an encapsulated world in itself. And for the underground man, this imposing glass structure was a sort of impious cathedral erected to the secular catechism of industrial capitalism. Dostoevsky himself visited the Crystal Palace in 1862, and he recorded his impressions of the building in his travel memoir he published in Russia the following year, which you see on the left of the screen there. Observing the massive crowds of people browsing among the building's vast array of merchandise offered by 14,000 exhibitors who had culled from around the world, Dostoevsky imagined that he had come face to face with the genuflections and idolatry typical of an ancient orgiastic fertility cult. It is kind of a biblical scene, he wrote. You should see on the quote on the bottom of the screen. It is kind of a biblical scene, something about Babylon, a kind of prophecy from the apocalypse fulfilled before your very eyes. Of course, the materialistic spectacle that so startled Dostoevsky has become our own unremarkable creed. Today we know this hedonistic Crystal Palace cult more prosaically as the culture of consumerism. Philosopher Peter Sloterdijk contends that contemporary capitalism found its paradigmatic expression in the 19th century hothouse environment of the Crystal Palace. In the confines of this fantastical building, humankind first encountered a psychedelic form of capitalism capable of transforming the proletarian public into solitary citizen consumers. Sorry, I'm having, I can't find the cursor. Anyway, the Crystal Palace, so Sloterdijk christened the Crystal Palace the world interior of capital. I'm just trying to find the, so I can scroll down. There we go, thank you. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that, it's okay. we've solved the problem. Slaughterdyke christened the Crystal Palace the world interior of capital. The Crystal Palace was the prototype for the innumerable theme parks and mega shopping malls that are now scattered around the planet. As one of the world's first genuine mass tourism events, it also helped set in motion the restive wanderlust that animates our own age. But if the cult of of consumer capitalism was conceived in the Crystal Palace, it has reached its architectural apogee today in a massive casino mega resort positioned on the southern coast of China in the 500-year-old city of Macau. We might call the Venetian resort the Venetian Palace. In the year 2019, a century and a half after Dostoevsky's visit to the Crystal Palace, nearly 40 million tourists descended upon the tiny city of Macau in a remarkable spectacle. 40 million tourists. Most of those tourists traveled from China, and 1 of every 2 arrivals visited the Venetian resort. If Dostoevsky were alive today, the Venetian would surely elicit his righteous indignation. Conceived and constructed by Sheldon Adelson, the billionaire Las Vegas entrepreneur and benefactor of right-wing regimes in the US and Israel, the Venetian is one of the world's biggest buildings and perhaps the largest enclosed themed environment on the planet. And though its walls are not made of glass, we might think of the Venetian as the Crystal Palace of our own age. And the Venetian is really sort of the focus of my book. While it's easy to dismiss the Venetian at first glance for its derivative faux aesthetics and hubristic excess, what makes it so fascinating is the way the building articulates a diverse collection of historical, economic, political, demographic, architectural, and atmospheric elements that have sort of converged in Macau today. And these elements have transformed the city into a global gaming powerhouse and one of the world's wealthiest locales. The Venetian, in turn, much like the Crystal Palace before it, is a sort of environmental hothouse, an architectonic biosphere for the cultivation of those numerous tourist visitors. And the Venetian is therefore a key component of what I call in the book casino capitalism. And the phrase casino capitalism is in the title of my book. And the book is an attempt to sort of theorize and explore and explicate that concept, which is often used but rarely explained in its application to Macau. So I use the phrase casino capitalism to refer to the didactic role that's played by Macau's casino resorts in China's economic reforms, and in the comportment of those nascent Chinese consumers who are so crucial to the future viability of the global economy. In the Venetian resort, we may observe in concentrated and intensified form capital's contemporary entreaties into the post-Mao PRC, which may be the final planetary frontier of consumer capitalism that started in the Crystal Palace. Those Chinese tourists have mobilized Macau's apostate status as the only legal site of casino gaming in China to transform the city into the most lucrative locus of gambling that the world has ever known. So that's the Crystal Palace, or the Venetian Palace. And I would like to move next to the second object that I want to talk about, which is the Golden Globe that sits in the lobby of the Venetian resort, and which probably all of you have seen at some point in your visits. So let me talk about the Golden Globe. In 2017, an anonymous tourist from mainland China lost $75 million playing high-stakes baccarat in an ill-fated gambling binge at Sheldon Adelson's Venetian Macau resort. And encompassed within that simple card game and its outsized stakes, which brought together this hapless Chinese high roller and one of the world's wealthiest men in a petite principality positioned on the farthest edge of Portugal's erstwhile global empire, is both a remarkable story of the history of capitalism and an allegory about the ontology of capital itself. And the tale begins with capitalism's birth in the mercantile trade of medieval Venice and culminates in its improbable contemporary renaissance today in the post-Mao China in the Venetian resort. The $75 million gambling windfall actually set a house record for the Venetian, and appreciative staff asked that gambler if there was anything they could do to assuage his loss or simply to thank him for his considerable contribution to the company's bottom line. Apparently impressed with the building's Baroque theme, the gambler requested a curious memento of his experience. He wanted a replica of the 2-meter-tall golden armillary sphere, or golden globe, that sits in the lobby of the Venetian resort, and which has been the picture-perfect backdrop for literally hundreds of thousands of tourist photos. That garish gilded globe is more than a mere keepsake of the gambler's $75 million Macau misadventure. The globe, which is an armillary sphere, the armillary sphere was a proto-navigational device that facilitated Portugal's founding of Macau during the Age of Discovery. And the Venetian globe is therefore a useful point of orientation from which to reflect on the city's seminal role in the emergence of the global capitalist system and its re-emergence in post-Mao China today. The Venetian's imposing reception hall with its fall-ceiling frescoes, armillary sphere centerpiece, and reflective checkerboard marble floor is actually not a reproduction of a site from Venice. It's a reproduction of the Royal Library in San Lorenzo de El Escorial outside the Spanish city of Madrid. The library is part of the 16th century palace and monastery complex that served as the residence of Spanish monarch Philip II, whose 40-year reign at the helm of the House of Habsburg commanded much of Europe and of the world. An armillary sphere is a model of the Earth encircled by concentric rings, or armillaries, which represent the planet's celestial environment and depict features of planetary orientation. And the specific sphere on which the Venetian version is loosely based was constructed in 1582 by cosmographer and mathematician Antonio Santucci. He presented it to Cardinal Ferdinand de' Medici, who delivered it to Philip II in Madrid, where the king kept it in El Escorial together with the other gifts he received from around the world. And Santucci's Ptolemaic sphere was essentially like an early mechanical GPS device. The intricate three-dimensional model has 82 elliptical ligatures that can be spun around to create intersecting points of orientation, such as latitude and longitude, with which it is possible to precisely map locations on the planet's surface. Santucci's sphere manifested the convergence of Renaissance science and Catholic faith that enabled Portuguese and Spanish seafarers to venture into the Atlantic Ocean, to encircle the entire Earth, and ultimately to create Europe's first global empire. And as an early maritime gateway between Europe and China, Macau was pivotal to that process. So in order to understand Macau's reprise of its original gateway function today in the global economy, 500 years after the city was founded, it's useful to locate the precise geohistorical coordinates of the city, much as King Philip may have done in those reflective moments in the Royal Library when he contemplated his expansive global empire on the elliptical surface of Santucci's sphere. And this kind of effort at global positioning of Macau is one of my goals in the book. But my aim is not a conventional history of Macau, because I'm not a historian like Catherine, and I didn't do any original historical research. I just drew on other people's histories of Macau. And what I tried to do instead was to pursue a history of the present, which begins by looking backwards from the vantage point of the Venetian resort today to try to unearth the complex course of descent by which this massive structure materialized in Macau's metropolitan milieu. And if we do that, we can trace a sort of shadow history of the global economy from the vantage point of the Venetian resort. And that's what I try to do in the first section of my book. And that history extends from the very origins of global capitalism in the medieval Mediterranean city-state of Venice to its contemporary construction of Sloterdijk's consumer world interior in Macau in the Venetian resort today. So the story's 500 years in the making, but much of the tale takes place in and around Macau's casinos, and one of the plot's key protagonists is the game of baccarat, which is the thing that attracts so many millions of Chinese tourists to Macau and generates the billions of dollars of revenue that make the Venetian viable. So because baccarat is so central to understanding Macau today. The third and final object that I want to talk about, just briefly, is a particular baccarat machine. And I'll explain what this machine is in a few minutes. So the third section of my book is devoted to an analysis of the game of baccarat. And it ends with an analysis of this baccarat machine, which I think is important to the future of Macau for reasons I'll explain in a moment. So baccarat is by far the most popular game in Macau's casinos, and it's the only game that was played in the city's once sacrosanct VIP rooms. And the Punto Banco version of baccarat, which is played in Macau, or that's the player-banker baccarat, which is played in Macau, is also a simple game of chance. It requires no decision by the gambler. The rules of baccarat are quite simple. Basically, there's two positions at the table, player and banker. Each position is dealt 2 cards, and the gambler bets merely on whether they think player or banker will have the better hand. The betting requires no decision by the gambler except a random guess on player or banker. It's not unlike betting on the flip of a coin, heads or tails. Punto Banco Baccarat is that simple. And all the gambler's doing is betting on whether player or banker will prevail. In the book, The Educated Gambler, Barry Hughes says this about baccarat. He says, to say that the actual play of baccarat is simple is an understatement. Most children's games are infinitely more complicated, and it is doubtful if baccarat played without stakes would hold the attention of any but the most backward child. That's probably true. It's like flipping a coin when it's played without stakes. But what's key is that it's played for stakes. And when it's played for stakes, when it's played for money, the experience of playing baccarat can be very dramatic. The stakes are the key. Baccarat also has the lowest house edge of any game in the casino, which means it has the best odds for the gambler. And this is the key to its appeal among Chinese gamblers in Macau. This is also the fundamental paradox of baccarat. Because the game has the best casino odds, if you're determined to bet, then it's entirely reasonable or entirely rational to choose to play baccarat because you have the best odds of winning. At the same time, because it's a simple game of chance, there's no way to calculate a reasonable or rational bet on the outcome of the game. And when it's played for high stakes, such as the bets of $1 million Hong Kong dollars per hand that are common among the whales who populate Macau's casinos, baccarat is characterized by what is known in the industry as volatility, with the possibility of extreme swings of profit and loss for both the gambler and the casino hosting the game. And this volatility emanates from the recondite mathematics underlying the straightforward player, banker, win or lose, up or down, all or nothing outcome of the game, at least when it's computed off across a discrete temporal duration, like a weekend gambling binge. Because the financial outcomes of baccarat are prone to such volatility, many Las Vegas casinos simply will not offer high-stakes baccarat as a game. In an industry whose profits are based entirely on predictable mathematical probabilities, baccarat is an outlier of a game. In the short term, the outcome of baccarat is simply unpredictable. Volatility is what imbues high-stakes baccarat with its singular exhilaration. However, in the case of Macau, this characteristic of the card play resonates beyond the baccarat table. With the opening of the Sands Casino in 2004, you see the pictures, I don't know if you can see them, but on the left side of the screen, you see pictures of opening day, where the prospective gamblers literally broke through the doors and barriers to get into the casino and start playing at the tables. With the opening of the Sands Casino in 2004, Macau's entire post-handover economy exploded unexpectedly with all the volatility of a high-stakes baccarat game. This outcome not only produced Macau's record-setting revenues, but also fundamentally altered the experiential qualities of city life itself. And for anyone who happened to live through it, Macau's rapid metamorphosis during this period was physically and psychically palpable. Given the significance of baccarat in Macau's casinos, we might understand the game's volatility as a vital element of the animal spirits of Macau's entire baccarat-based economy. And animal spirits is an evocative idiom coined by John Maynard Keynes to describe the contagious emotional qualities of the market. So the animal spirits of Macau's baccarat-based economy are animated by the volatility of baccarat. The city's ephemeral volatility is physically manifested in such visible phenomena today as a sudden preponderance of brightly hued high-end sports cars which have appeared in significant numbers on Macau's diminutive city streets in the post-handover era. And I call this tracking of Lamborghinis the Lamborghini metric for measuring Macau's volatility. And prior to the handover of Macau in 1999, as far as I know, there was only one Lamborghini registered in Macau, and that's the one you see in this picture here. That Lamborghini was a handsome deep purple model which was owned by Broken Tooth Wan Kwok Koi, who, as you all know, probably was Macau's most flamboyant and notorious gangster. The car sometimes featured in photos that accompanied Broken Tooth's many interviews with international media, as well as appearing prominently in the autobiographical film that Broken Tooth financed about his own ascension through the ranks of Macau's underworld. And you see a screen grab from that film Casino, starring his own car. And by the way, he was ultimately jailed in part based on that film that he made about his own gangland exploits in Macau. So before 1999, there was one Lamborghini in Macau. By 2011, one decade later, there were 5 Lamborghinis registered in Macau. But 3 short years after that, in 2014, the number of Lamborghinis had jumped 20-fold to 106. In addition to that impressive array of 106 Lambos, in 2014, there were also 131 Ferraris, 158 Maseratis in Macau as well. Automobili Lamborghini was so impressed by the Macau market that in 2017, the company spent $1 million to open a local showroom. If we include Macau's 523 Bentleys and 250 Rolls Royces, which were also registered that year, there were about 2 superlative cars for every kilometer of road in Macau. Of course, flashy cars are a normal consequence of quick money, but Macau's powerful coupes stand out as a brazen aberration in a tiny city whose streets are constrained by a maximum speed limit of 60 kilometers per hour. If there's any Americans here, that would be 37 miles per hour, the maximum speed limit. The serpentine streets of the central city are more like a Byzantine medieval labyrinth than a modern roadway system, and there's certainly no place to drive a Lamborghini. The company's Hurricane Spider convertible, which debuted in 2017 at Macau's new Lamborghini showroom, accelerates from 0 to 100 in 3.5 seconds, which means it would take 1 second for it to surpass the maximum speed limit in the city. But legal limits aside, the city streets are so full of distracted, ambling, selfie-snapping Chinese tourists that there's really no way that daredevil driving is even possible. So the Lambo drivers have little to do in their cars other than to noisily rev the idle engines in a way that contributes to the overall ambient volatility of the city. And that very volatility that makes high-stakes baccarat so exciting and so profitable is also the source of the particular constellation of macroeconomic constraints and petty corruption concerns of the Chinese government. So when President Xi Jinping urges Macau to be more like Las Vegas, as you see in this Wall Street Journal headline, the underlying message is that the city should seek to tame the volatility of baccarat, and that's what they've tried to do. This is exactly what happened last year with the surprise decision to criminalize Macau's entire VIP junket industry with the arrest of Alvin Chow and Levo Chan and many of their confederates from Sun City and Tak Chun junket businesses. And this decision was prompted in part by the claim by China's Ministry of Public Security that 1 trillion renminbi flows across the Chinese border each year into overseas gambling. That is to say, 1 trillion renminbi is spent each year on the game of baccarat. And we only need to remember that one high roller in the Venetian I mentioned earlier who lost $75 million playing baccarat and went home with only that garish gilded golden globe as a memento of his experience. In 2007, LifeTech Group, a Hong Kong biopharmaceutical company devoted to research and development of devoted to research and development of drug innovations that treat hepatitis B and liver fibrosis, diversified into the design and manufacture of gaming machines for Macau's casino industry. And the company's innovation was this game called the Paradise Box. And this Paradise Box device, which is a hybrid cyborg convergence of man and machine, offers a baccarat game devoid of volatility. The solitary gambler at the Paradise Box device does not need the service of a croupier to deal the cards, or a junket loan to finance his gambling. And the electronic baccarat game's reduced labor costs means that the casino can lower the maximum bet, the minimum bet, by 50 times, enabling the mass market player to play this version of baccarat. This electronic device, which is designed by biopharmaceutical engineers, comprises a sort of biopolitical selection to the geopolitical problem of volatility, and promises to tame once and for all the animal spirits of Macau's baccarat-based economy. My specific interest in the Paradise Box, though, is its role as a kind of device that transforms that simple game of baccarat into a complex form of capitalist enterprise, in which renders the individual gambler into a sort of entrepreneur of the self, a form of human capital that's conducive to China's reform-era economy. So that discussion of the baccarat machine brings me back to the Crystal Palace, because the Paradise Box is the embodiment of everything that Dostoevsky despised about the intellectual and technological forces that had constructed the Crystal Palace. In Notes from Underground, the underground man feared that when humans were subjected to the graphs and timetables and test tubes typical of a utilitarian social order, the ultimate consequence would be the loss of free will, the taming of the individual's innate impulses, and man's ultimate reduction by science to a mere machine. In fact, Dostoevsky himself was a gambling addict, and for one period of his life, which was the worst but also most productive period of his life, he was addicted to playing the game of roulette. And he understood his addiction to roulette as an expression of his own innate and vitalist animal spirits. His embrace of the mystical art of risk on pure chance was an affinity he shared with those Portuguese explorers who 500 years ago bet it all to risk sailing to China, as well as the Macau's high-stakes baccarat players today who wager millions on the random cards dealt to banker or player. And the Paradise Box baccarat machine is an innovative technological affront to those animal spirits. The gaming machine attempts to discover a rationalist resolution to the problem of volatility in baccarat and to dissolve the game's disruptive potential. So that's the importance of the baccarat machine to my discussion. So anyway, today I talked briefly about these three objects: the Crystal Palace, the Golden Globe, and the baccarat machine. And that's a little sample of the approach that I take in the book, although in the book I analyze many other objects and devices like this. And I hope that by doing so, I'm able to explore Macau's formative role in this new era of global capitalism, which is going to be dominated by the PRC. So that's my discussion of my book. I really appreciate everybody coming here. Thank you very much. And I would be happy if anyone had any questions or comments to share. And before I say anything else, I said I would show you Catherine's book. So This is Catherine Chan's book, if you're interested, The Macanese Diaspora in British Hong Kong, A Century of Trans-Imperial Drifting. And she launched her own book, I guess last year, fairly recently at the Portuguese bookstore. So maybe some of you were there, but thank you again for joining me today. So that's it, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Floor is open for questions. We've got about 15, 20 minutes before the next panel. Anyone got a question? Yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I am an architect and a historian, and the Crystal Palace, I don't agree with Dostoevsky, because the Crystal Palace was not a shopping center, it was an exhibition of the Industrial Revolution, and most of the things that it showed were rigid machine, so the steam machines, also things from archaeological value from other countries, and he started a fashion of industrial exhibitions that later we have in Paris, and we have the Eiffel Tower as an example of this kind of exhibitions. So I think more than the commercial capitalist show was a show of the British Empire and the faith they have in, not really in religion, but in science, influenced by the Darwinism and the thing. So I don't know if this would be, I would like your opinion about this, but I think the capitalists start, according to Roll Knox, much earlier in the Middle Ages. In the first millennium, when the economy started to develop in Central Europe. So this is it, my just comment, but I know Macau Venetian is like a crystal palace, but I think the function is a little bit different. Just like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your description of the Crystal Palace is definitely accurate. It was all the things that you just described. It was a sort of explication of the British colonial power. It was a focus on scientific achievements, on it was an expression of ideas about Darwinism. All the things you said, I think, are definitely part of what the Crystal Palace was. And I didn't mean to say that capitalism began with the Crystal Palace. It was Peter Sloterdijk's idea is that this particular version of consumerism, he traces it back to the Crystal Palace. I think there's a lot of arguments about the birth of capitalism and where it started. And in my book, I'm sort of inspired by Fernand Braudel, and he locates the origins of capitalism in Venice, actually in Venice, Genoa, and Florence, the three Italian city-states. In medieval times, just like you said, in the Mediterranean. But he pinpoints Venice for several reasons. He makes the argument that Venice is probably the birthplace of capitalism. And for the opportunistic purposes of my book, it works very well to say Venice is the birthplace because it leads to the Venetian, the fake Venice in Macau. So it makes a nice narrative connection between Venice and the Venetian. But I think the Crystal Palace is just one moment in that much longer history of the development of global capitalism. But the Crystal Palace is interesting in part because of the architectural form and the idea that all of those characteristics of capitalism were suddenly put indoors inside of one building. And I think that was what was interesting about the Crystal Palace for Sloterdijk, and that's probably what Dostoevsky didn't like about the Crystal Palace. I like it too. I agree with you. I don't necessarily share Dostoevsky's criticism, but I think he's he has an interesting analysis of the building. But it's the interior, the idea of a encapsulated and interiorized world in the Crystal Palace that I find interesting and which is so applicable to Macau, especially because the Venetian is not a standalone resort. It's actually one component it's the anchor of a 4-resort complex, which includes the Venetian, the Four Seasons, the Parisian, and the Londoner. And they're all connected together by these pedestrian walkways, these enclosed pedestrian walkways. And so two of those are, the Venetian and the Londoner are two of the largest buildings in the world. So when you connect together those two buildings along with the other two buildings, you have this massive single encapsulated interiorized space in Macau, which I think is maybe the largest single enclosed space in the world. I don't know that for sure, but it's at least one of them. If we count all of that as one giant enclosure. And it is one giant enclosure because you can enter any of those resorts and then you can walk to all of them without ever leaving. And probably you've all done that at some point. Spent a whole day just ambling around in that Venetian palace or Venetian complex, as we might call it. But thank you for your insight.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Hello, I was interested in the connections you established between consumerism in China, capitalism, Portugal, and the role of the Portuguese in Macau. And now you mentioned Brodel, but Brodel allocated very little space to Portugal, and you said that it influenced you. So would you mind saying a bit more about those connections? Because I'm not very clear on what your argument is. Thank you.
The connections between Portugal and capitalism?
You seem to have established a connection between consumerism in China, the development of Macau, the capitalist model of the casinos, and I'm interested in hearing more about that, please.
Yeah, Portugal had the first global empire. It was fundamental to the construction of the capitalist world system, the global capitalist system. And in Portugal's initial maritime explorations, Macau became a crucial port to manage the trade between China and the West. And so Macau was crucial to the very origins of the global capitalist system. And then it sort of fell into a state of obscurity. After its initial golden age, it kind of fell into a state of obscurity, and the world passed it by. And Macau was one of those last remaining outsides that was not anymore part of the global economic system. In fact, Macau, for a couple of centuries, capitalized off the fact that it was kind of outside of that system. It started off as a crucial part of that global capitalist system, and then it got sort of left outside of it, and it capitalized on the way that it was outside of the system. And then, because of some kind of historical accidents, suddenly Macau found itself again at the center of a new era of capitalism that was emerging in China with China's economic reforms. And so it just happened to be in the right place at the right time to capitalize off this new era. And in my book, I try to make the connection between that earlier period of Macau 500 years ago and then the contemporary period. I agree that you're right. Brodel doesn't say a lot about Portugal, although he does say that Portugal, I can't remember the quote, but it's like the shot heard around the world. He said something like that. They started something that changed the entire world. He has a quote about Portugal like that. But you're right, he doesn't say a lot about Portugal. He only mentions Macau very briefly in his work. But anyway, I just try to draw that connection between Macau's role, the original emergence of the capitalist system 500 years ago and then its reemergence today.
All right, we've got time for one last quick question. Anyone?
Thank you for your presentation, and your presentation about the Crystal Palace and the Venetian made me think of one of the philosophers called Walter Benjamin in his arcade project. He dedicated to the 19th century's Paris like shopping street, which is much like the Venetian resort today. So in that time, the consumerism of that time, how do you think, what's your opinion about that time and the consumerism you mentioned in your book and this time, the connection and the contrast? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. The arcades in Paris are very similar expression of the same sort of consumer architectural interior space that we see in the Crystal Palace. I think they're expressions of the same kind of idea. And Sloterdijk in his book also talks about the arcades and Benjamin's discussion of the arcades project. And this is one thing that makes Macau such an interesting place to look at today, because all of these things are reconstructed here in Macau. So if you go to the Parisian resort in Macau, you can see a fake version of the arcades in Paris, 19th century Paris, just like we can see a fake Venice in the Venetian. So, and also there's a Crystal Palace. There's a fake Crystal Palace in the lobby of the Londoner. So all of these environments are sort of recreated in Macau today, and they're all part of that one giant complex of resorts. So yes, thank you.
Okay. One last question.
Oh, sure. I was really struck by these resonances that you felt visiting these reproductions of historic objects and sites. And I wonder how much are those resonances in the minds of the architects who build these places, the designers who design them. So what are the kind of intentions behind these constructions? And then also, how much are they in the minds of the visitors coming from China and maybe being attracted to the kind of image of glamour and flash, but not putting this together? So is this just serendipity that we can see these connections in Macau, or are they present at the level of intention and at the level of reception?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know the answer to that, but I agree that not everyone is going to visit these places and see it in the way that I've described it here. But that's part of what I'm trying to do, is take the familiar object or environment or building or whatever and sort of scratch the surface and then uncover the story that exists behind it or underneath it. The one architect that I talked to who designed some of these environments in Macau is Paul Steelman. I did interview him, and he worked on the Venetian and some of the other resorts, but the one that he's most famous for, most known for, is the design of the original Sands Casino. And I could put it up here, but we've changed from the PowerPoint. But earlier I showed a couple of slides. I showed a slide with a couple of images of the Sands Casino, and he's the one who envisioned and developed that casino design for the Sands, which he called the most unique design of a casino ever. And what's different about the Sands was it was a casino designed to appeal to Chinese gamblers in Macau. So he came to Macau first and did field work and tried to watch gamblers in action. And then he had only one weekend to design the casino. And the plot, the land plot that Sheldon Adelson had for the Sands by the ferry terminal was very small. So he couldn't make a big, expansive resort with a big footprint, as is common in Cotai. So instead he made the building go up, and he put the casino on the second floor, and he had this idea of making this super high ceilings, like 60-something foot ceiling. And there had never been a casino like that before. And he had the idea, I won't go into the details, but based on his observation of how of the kind of gambling habits that he observed among Chinese gamblers, he tried to make a casino that would appeal to the Chinese gambler. So there was, at least in some cases, there was an effort, there was a lot of thought put into the design based on trying to make it adapt to the local environment of Macau. But I don't think we could say the same thing about the Venetian or the Parisian or the Londoner. I think they're completely opportunistic casino designs that actually replicate, many of them replicate casino resorts that exist in other places. There's a Venetian in Las Vegas, and there are many Venetians now in China, different places in China. That's a very popular themed environment that is easily replicated all over the world. But I certainly take the point of your question, which is a very good question.
Okay, so thank you everyone for joining this panel, and join me in congratulating Tim. Thank you.